There were a broad range of changes in the 1980s, many of which had major social and cultural implications. Some of these changes included changes of salaries and cost of living, changes in racial relations in the 1980s, and an increase in a consumption-based society that I would argue was obsessive about public image. So in the 1980s, the average salary in 1980 was $19,000. And in 1989, the average salary increased to $27,000. And of course, this was dependent on the field in which a person worked, with menial jobs being still at the base end of the socioeconomic class. Economics in the 1980s had broad implications, with a shift from mainly middle-class society to an increase in extremes of poverty and wealth. This can be traced to a change in social programs that served as a safety net, no longer emphasized and utilized by just the poor. They were increasingly, the programs shifted to a safety net for the wealthy to maintain wealth, a trend that continues in our modern society 40 years later. This is in part due to the election of Ronald Reagan for 2 terms in the 1980s. His administration held in focus traditional values in a way that negatively affected marginalized members of society, which leads us to racial disparities. They were still a major concern for ethnic minorities in the 1980s, with an increase in popularity of zero tolerance for drug policies, which disproportionately increased the imprisonment of ethnic minorities and the poor. And this was often called the school to prison pipeline, which the implications of which are that public schools were a funnel into the criminal justice system for disenfranchised youth. Additionally, scapegoating of races and utilizing of stereotypes playing into the nation's fears of minorities, striving for a more equitable society, and changing the status quo and implications for white Americans. I think that there was also an increase in desire for a higher status, even though the middle class was less represented in the 1980s, with a decline of 20% of families falling into a middle class section of society. Socioeconomically, status became more of an issue for society in the 1980s, and I'd argue it was because it was more of an image-centric culture, and that's because people were increasingly concerned with appearing to be in touch with pop culture, such as movies, music, and television, which they had an increasing access to at home, with the media being more, like I said, more accessible at home, such as movies, music, and television. Cable TV had increased in popularity in the 1980s. VHS and VCRs were available for at-home use. And additionally, people had access to things like camcorders to record their own media. Cassettes and vinyls were still popular with most consumers because CDs had been invented. However, they were very expensive. So that's another disparity in social class. Additionally, professional sports became popularized. And I would say that this has to do with the rise of cable TV and the Olympics being hosted in San Francisco in 1984. And moving back to media, at-home entertainment like television shows on cable networks such as Who's the Boss, Family Ties, and the very popular Cosby Show. And additionally, dramas like Dallas and Dynasty, access to 24-hour news networks like CNN, sporting channels like ESPN, music television, MTV, Nickelodeon, all were popular in the 1980s and became increasingly popular. And essentially, a lot of people argued that these were just commercials for products, such as children's toys and other lifestyle products that increased one's social status. Additionally, access to televangelists, so through cable TV, affected religion in the era. So television, movies, and music influenced consumption and fashions in the 1980s. So additionally, rap and pop music became more popular and influenced fashions and culture at the time as well. Additionally, there were changes in family dynamics as well in the 1980s, with a lot of families having to have two incomes to be able to sustain a lifestyle, as well as a rise of single-parent families, all of which had to rely on out-of-the-home daycare centers. There were a lot of changes, as I mentioned, in the 1980s, and the social and cultural implications are still seen today.